This is the video lecture for part 6, 20th Century and Beyond. This is going to be the first few chapters of it. So we'll just get right into it. 20th century obviously starts in the year 1900. It doesn't have a cool name like the Romantic era or the Baroque period, and a big reason for that is because there are so many different things going on in the 20th century. We can call the Renaissance because most of the music and art from this period, everyone was doing very similar things. You can't really call the 20th century any specific thing. You can call it the jazz century, you can call it the atonal century, you can call it the impressionistic century or the expressionistic century. There are so many different movements that are going on that you can't really just pick one to single out. But some of the things, there are some commonalities among much of the music and art, including the goal of artists becomes more to evoke some kind of a reaction. We can say to shock an audience as opposed to just generate basic um, pleasant emotions. Music or art or literature was supposed to make you happy or maybe supposed to make you sad to some degree. In the 20th century, they just might want you to stop and go, what am I looking at? Or even make you angry or something like that. And this is consistent across all art forms. Modern dance is very different than classical ballet and very famously caused a riot at the first performance of one ballet that we will talk about later in the unit. Um, Cubism was a new form of art that we will see in a moment in this slideshow. Abstract art, for the first time, maybe in history, artists were creating art that was not actually supposed to look like anything specific. And then some artists, including musicians, created art that deliberately distorted things. Could be used as a form of social protest, or as I said, an attempt to just evoke some kind of reaction from an audience that, quite frankly, has become more numb to things over the years. So you have to go even further and further out to even get a reaction. Another interesting thing about the 20th century is that not only you have this wide diversity of styles, but you also have a wide diversity of people who become welcome in the arts. So here are just a couple of paintings that we can see. First by Kandinsky, it's titled In Gray. This is an example of abstract art. You look at it and it doesn't look like anything specific. If you look closely at it, you can see things in it that might remind you of certain objects, but it's not a painting of anything specific necessarily. Even the title, In Gray, is very vague. And then next to that, you have Picasso painting Cubism, which was basically an attempt to see objects from multiple angles at the same time. It was a way to just reinvent the way you looked at things. From our perspective, one of the major things that happened in the 20th century is the United States becomes a major economic, political, and artistic power. Whereas the cultural capitals historically had always been in places like Paris or Vienna or Venice during the Renaissance, the cultural capitals actually shift to the United States, to New York and to Hollywood. You also see non-Western art influencing people in the West. Picasso was very influenced by African sculpture that he had seen. The great architect Frank Lloyd Wright was very inspired by Japanese concepts of design and architecture. And a gentleman we will talk about later in this unit, John Cage, was a musician who was very strongly influenced by Indian philosophy in his music. Of course, technology continues to expand from very basic, what we view as today as being incredibly primitive technology. But at the time, it was groundbreaking technology. And as technology accelerates faster and faster, I mean, heck, even what I'm doing right now, recording a lecture with a PowerPoint and using examples, this is something that you could not have done even 20 years ago without a lot of very expensive computer equipment in your house. And now we also start to see that in the 20th century, as society slowly, creepingly becomes more equitable, you see more racial minorities, religious minorities, and women become much more represented in all of these different arts. So the first chapter kind of discusses musical styles in the first half of the 20th century. And the most important thing to, I think, really take away from this period is that there's so many changes in music, more changes than at any time in previous musical history. Going back, I don't know, maybe until the 1100s, 1200s, there might have been more changes during that period, but not by many. Composers were experimenting with lots of different things. Many times they looked at tradition and rules as something to avoid or something to deliberately break. Composers would rewrite the rules for each piece of music that they would compose. So, we're going to hear some music during this period that might sound really, really weird to you. Some of it sounds really weird to me, and I've been listening to this stuff for 30 years. But if you really give it a chance, I think you'll discover that a lot of this music is really interesting, really cool, and really groundbreaking as well. As I was saying, it's a time of real diversity in music. We see many non Western musics influencing Western music, folk music, popular music. The bridge between jazz and classical music becomes almost erased by various composers. Popular music and classical music become merged to a large degree. Asian music, African music, Latin American music all become incorporated in all of these different forms of music. Artists, musicians, and musicologists, there's a term we haven't talked about before. A musicologist is someone who studies music history, uh, researched and went back and found medieval music, Renaissance music, and Baroque music, which, after having been more or less not performed for hundreds of years, much of it was rediscovered and performed live, and recordings were made of it. So, what we're going to see is there's an extension of the Romantic era for some composers, but for many other composers, they look well beyond anything that had been happening in classical music before. Let's get into specific characteristics. Now, it's hard to define characteristics of 20th century music because, as I said, there are so many different things happening in 20th century music. But there are some consistencies. Much of the music was using a lot more percussion instruments, including instruments that were non traditional percussion instruments, things like sirens and brake drums, literally the brake drum from a car that you would strike with a metal mallet to create a certain sound. To create new timbres, they would group instruments in very unusual and non traditional ways. And a lot of times, instead of thinking so much about writing so that all of the instruments blend together, creating a beautiful, homogeneous sound, they would write more in ways to emphasize these individual tone colors. There's one composer named Anton Webern who actually would write melodies not based on the notes, but based instead on the sounds of the instruments. Those are called Klangfarben melodies, which is one of my favorite words of all time, by the way. Klangfarben melody, which literally means tone color melody. Speaking of melody, melodies in the 20th century become very unpredictable. They skip around a lot. They're frequently not easy to whistle. If you remember back when we were talking about Mozart, Mozart wrote amazing earworms that after hearing a Mozart piece once, it would stick in your brain. That's not something you're going to hear in a lot of 20th century music. A lot of the melodies in 20th century music are complicated. They're not intuitive melodies at all. They're not based upon the harmonies necessarily that they're happening above or below. And composers also began to write and adopt, and in some cases invent, brand new scales that, quite frankly, we're not going to recognize. We're so locked into the idea of major and minor tonalities, which is the vast majority of music today is based in major minor tonalities. A lot of popular music is based around the blues scale that we talked about all the way back when we were talking about jazz and blues. Harmonies, well, harmonies become very complicated. We get dissonance, sometimes dissonance leading to more dissonance. Consonance becomes kind of a quaint memory at times. And there are new chords, including something called a polychord. Now, a polychord happens when you have two different chords that are played at the same time. It's consonant, but it can actually be two consonants is piled on top of each other, which creates a dissonance. Could sound something like this. Now that is a weird sounding chord, but it's actually two chords on top of each other. A fourth chord, which is based on different intervals than traditionally, and even a tone cluster, which is when you essentially were to depress all of the keys on a piano that are right next to each other at the same time. Now these unusual dissonant polychords, they can sound very crazy and very dissonant, but they can be used in a lot of ways. This particular piece by Stravinsky, they're used to kind of propel the music forward. This is a polychord. The strings underneath are playing rhythmically a polychord. So that's two different chords piled on top of each other at the same time. It's quite dissonant. It's intended to be quite dissonant. But then this is a piece by Aaron Copland, and this is also a polychord. It's actually an A major chord and an E major chord being sounded in sequence, and it's actually quite beautiful. So that's also a polychord, but a lot of it has to do with the volume and how aggressively you play them, I suppose, to see how aggressive they or how dissonant they actually sound to you. Composers were, as I mentioned, exploring a lot of different tonal systems. The modes, if you think all the way back to when we were talking about Gregorian chant, they used unusual scales. Common at the time, they became unusual, which are called modes. Scales like major and minor, but the notes are stacked differently, so they sound and they resolve very differently to what we're used to. Other composers would explore the idea of, well, we talked about a polychord when we had two different chords at the same time. Polytonality is music that is written in two different key centers at the same time. So think of it almost like a polychord, but happening over a long period of time. And then one composer named Arnold Schoenberg developed this concept of atonality, which means basically the music is not based on any central note at all. And we will listen to a little bit of Schoenberg's music later. Rhythm becomes extremely complex, very irregular meters that are of different lengths, where the beats are of different lengths. A lot of this comes from the influence of world music, because a lot of composers were experimenting with going out into the countryside in Romania, for example, or in England, and recording people playing their folk tunes, singing their folk songs. And a lot of times the rhythms were not stable, standard, equally balanced rhythms and meters like we were used to. Also, the elements of syncopation that we heard in ragtime music in the late 1800s, which made their way into jazz, influenced classical music a great deal. And as we had polychords, we also can have polyrhythms. A polyrhythm, just like a polychord, is when you have more than one rhythm happening at the same time. This is a very basic polyrhythm. It's when you have three beats going on at the same time that two beats are going on. It sounds like this. That's literally three beats going on in one hand on the piano while two beats are going on in the other hand. And there are many kind of polyrhythms that composers would experiment with, as well as these asymmetrical meters. And we'll look at some of those as we go through the music in this period. Probably the greatest changes that happened in the 20th century, though, were brought along by the advent of recording technology. As you've heard me say about 10,000 times, before the 1900s, if you wanted to hear music, you had to experience it live, either by going somewhere where people were going to perform music live, or by, in most cases, performing it yourself at home. Performing music at home was a huge way that people would entertain themselves and spend time together. But as soon as recording devices were invented in the late 1800s, and then in the 1920s, the first commercial radio stations went online. The first commercial radio stations, trivia, was KDKA, which broadcast for the first time in Pittsburgh in 1920. And then eventually television in the 1950s meant that you never even had to leave your house. And then, of course, later computers and streaming. Now you don't have to leave your house at all to hear great music, to see performances of great music of all genres. The development of YouTube, which I still don't understand how YouTube hasn't violated every copyright law known to mankind, but it's still there, means that you can see so much music and hear so much music without having to leave your house. That's both a great thing and a bad thing in some ways, because in my opinion, music has become viewed as a more disposable commodity than it used to be. Music, when it was only available live, I think had to have been a more special experience than now, where it's everywhere. You go to the grocery store, it's, you hear it over the loudspeakers, it's in your car, it's in your phone, it's pretty much everywhere. Another aspect of what happened in the 20th century, while we've been talking about all of these interesting and strange inventions that went against what people were used to some degree that alienated a lot of listeners. Concert goers, they would hear some of this crazy new music and they would think, no, that's too weird for me. And then they would retreat to old music, things like Mozart and Beethoven. And so symphony orchestras, well, they knew what their patrons wanted, so they started to program more and more old music, which is really when classical music became more of a museum society and focused much more on older music instead of newer music. So in the 20th century, really for the first time in history, the audience demanded old music, not new music. Also in the 20th century, as I mentioned, we start to see more women, more African Americans, more Asian Americans, more Americans of Latino descent, people from all over the world who become very notable in the fields of being composers, performing musicians, and music educators. The opportunities become more available and are taken advantage of. Now, the 20th century is an interesting time because while democracy is spreading throughout the world, there are still totalitarian governments. You had the USSR, the Soviet Union, which controlled the arts. They demanded of their painters and playwrights and authors and composers that they create music that was not in any way crazy, unbalanced, anything that might alienate a typical person, just the average person on the street. They demanded that all art be easily accessible to everybody. Now, and by the way, if they determined that you were a, quote, formalist, which was an accusation of writing music that was too modern, that would alienate the audience, you stood a chance in the Soviet Union of being arrested and sent to a prison camp, a labor camp, or even killed outright. In Nazi Germany in the 1930s into the 40s, of course, they banned all music by Jewish composers, both living and dead. And so many musicians, as well as architects and scientists and anyone who was really an intellectual, were forced to flee Europe in the 1930s and come to the United States or England in most cases to flee the Nazis, which was incredible for America. Many of the great musicians like Kurt Weill or Igor Stravinsky, Paul Hindemith, these are great musicians who were forced to flee Europe due to the Nazis and made amazing contributions to American society, as well as scientists. Half of the scientists that developed the atom bomb and nuclear power and the rocket programs, the space program, were Europeans who fled Germany. So it's really interesting that by banning all contemporary thinking, people who were really forward thinking wound up moving to the United States and other countries. So in the past, many artists supported themselves by wealthy members of society, members of the nobility, hiring them and paying them to be their own personal composer or painter or whatever. Well, we don't see that in the 20th century anymore, but what we do see is universities step in, and now composers musicians can get hired at universities, and in exchange for teaching classes, then you get paid a good salary, which gives you the financial security and financial freedom to continue to be creative. It's a great gig. I have no complaints at all about that. So that's the end of this particular lecture. We will move forward with a couple more of these where I will cover specific composers and their music.